stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight. O'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free, and the home of the brave.
Again, let me add my welcome to this opportunity. Western is proud to host this town hall. Let me start by introducing our senator. Ron Wyden was first elected to Congress in 1980 to represent Oregon's 3rd District. In 1996, he was elected to the U.S. Senate in a special election, becoming the first U.S. Senator to be elected in a vote-by-mail election. He was sworn in on February 5th, 1996, to the seat once held by his mentor, U.S. Senator Wayne Morse. Senator Wyden serves on the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Committees on Budget, Energy and Natural Resources, and Finance. Senator Wyden has a long-time commitment to affordable higher education, having proposed greater federal funding to state investments in higher education through a matching program. He's also sponsored legislation to ensure that students have better information about higher education, legislation that identifies the average debt of graduating students from universities. Most recently, he and Senator Markley have introduced legislation that addresses student debt and educational opportunity. The Partnership Act would provide federal matching funds for states that agree to freeze or reduce the cost of tuition and bring up graduation rates. The bill signals to states and colleges that the federal government wants to be a partner in making college affordable. The Afford Act, which would give all borrowers peace of mind, the bill makes student debt more manageable by ensuring that no borrower has to pay more than 10% of his or her discretionary income on student loan payments. Any unpaid balance after 20 years would be forgiven. These are examples of his commitment to higher education, which I deeply appreciate as president at Western Oregon University. When Senator Wyden was elected senator in 1996, he promised to do a town hall in every county every year. After more than 700 town halls, let's give a Western Oregon University welcome and a Polk County welcome to U.S. Senator Ron Wyden, Town Hall number 784.
Thank you. Thank you, President Fuller. That is a very inflationary introduction. And we've got Mayor John, and where is Mayor Steve? Is floating around there. We're just filled with mayors. And let's give Steve a big round of applause, too. You know, you're mayor of a modest size Oregon community, and you get a lot of perks. You know, you get a mansion, you get drivers, you get cooks, and John, am I missing something? Oh, I thought maybe that was kind of the way it was. But I really appreciate being here, being home. I was on the floor of the United States Senate, I think, till about 2 a.m. on Thursday. We can talk about where things are with the Affordable Care Act and the like, but I especially appreciate being home, being in Polk County, and John and Steve are doing such wonderful work for the community. We wanted to make sure they would also get a flag that was flown over the Capitol. And John, big thanks to you, and just so appreciate everything you've done for this community. Let's give John a big round of applause, too. All right. Now, how many of you have never been to one of our town hall meetings? Raise your hands if you have. Okay, we got a lot of newcomers. Well, what happens is I usually start off talking for like about 45 minutes or so. And it's really a lot of fun. And some of those folks over there think I'm serious. Their face got all pale. No. This is part of the pledge that I made to Oregon back in 1995. We were choosing our first new United States Senator in 34 years. And I said, if I have the honor to be chosen, I will throw open the doors of government. And I will come to every county every year. It'll take 90 minutes or so. You can see I'm not reading from any teleprompters or that kind of thing, but we'll just kind of do it the way the Founding Fathers wanted us to do it. We'll talk about what you're interested in. I'll do my best to respond. It was a great compliment when Senator Merkley was elected. He chose to do this as well. So this is really getting to be kind of an Oregon thing, which is just throwing open the doors of government. And people always ask about lobbyists and things like that. And whenever they come to our office, I say, well, what you might want to do is make an argument that would impress people at one of our town hall meetings, because that's kind of my measure of the way government's supposed to work. So with that, I think, John, you're just going to call out names and let people talk about whatever they're interested in, right?
So the first question comes from ticket number 564. There's 564. And on deck is 525.
It's also been interesting since I've been home. I can tell exactly the difference in Oregon communities by people's footwear. And we live right off Cesar Chavez in Glenwood, and so when I got home, the driveway had like 13 inches of snow, which means that I've got footwear for that, and I see some of you somehow managed to get by with a dusting or so. So it's kind of a little bit of how we all measure Oregon over the last few days. Yeah, go ahead. Question was, how as citizens do you work for environmental protection? And probably your question, which is a very good one, is not exactly dissimilar from other kinds of questions. I mean, I feel very strongly that political change doesn't start in a bunch of government buildings somewhere. Maybe it does once in a while, but it usually doesn't start in Washington, D.C. or Salem and then kind of trickle down to everybody. It's usually just the opposite. It's kind of bottoms up. So as people locally begin to get concerned about environmental policies, maybe are interested in climate change or clean water or protection of public, lands, you get together with your friends and you put together letters and you arrange for meetings with elected officials and you speak out when there are programs like this. And I was director of the Gray Panthers, the senior citizens group, for about 7 years before I was elected to Congress. And back then, if a town had a lunch program for older people, that was considered a big deal. I was like, wow, that's a big senior citizens program. And so I probably had my formative experiences about government really built around your question. And I think particularly in our state, it's all about citizens coming together and speak out. I was just on the Capitol steps talking about fair immigration reform. I imagine we'll talk a little about that topic, gesundheit, over the course of the afternoon. So to me, political change is about bringing together your friends and neighbors and shaking the political system at its grassroots. That respond to your question? Okay.
The Trump and Russia connection, how do we ensure an investigation goes forward?
Yeah. There was some good news yesterday. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. My older child calls it the so-called Intelligence Committee. And there was a statement put out. I had already gotten home, but I had talked with them over the course of the day. The chairman of the committee, Richard Burr, and the ranking Democrat, Mark Warner, put out a joint statement indicating that this was going to be a bipartisan inquiry and it would, in fact, look at any contacts between, for example, the Trump campaign and the Russians. And I had really launched that earlier in the week. James Comey, the head of the FBI, had come before the Intelligence Committee, and I was just reading from prepared news articles. And one of them mentioned a Soviet foreign minister who said we had had contacts with the Trump campaign. And so my question to Mr. Comey was, have you followed up on these press reports? And if so, what are your findings? And Mr. Comey said, well, we don't ever talk about whether there are investigations in public. And suffice it to say, there was a fair amount of eyeball rolling in the room, and that led to yesterday's announcement, which I thought was good. I mean, big stuff that's important, requires that you work in a bipartisan way, and so a lot of us put a lot of effort into getting that agreement yesterday afternoon. I think it's going to be what you need to do to really look into this in a thoughtful way. Great question. Just 1 second, I gotta get my manners back here a little bit. In addition to Steve, and we've got John, wait a minute, we've got two Johns. John Oberst and John McArdle is floating around somewhere. Thank you, John. We're glad to see you. And I think your state representative, who's working hard in Salem, where's Paul floating around? Paul, glad to see you. And I guess everybody in town's called John because there's John Kerry, too. And we like him. Where's he with the city council? Okay. Any other Johns out there that I missed? Okay. But we appreciate all of you, and feel free at any point, Johns or other elected officials, to speak up too. The question was, how can we get the entire country to vote by mail? I've introduced legislation to take Oregon's vote by mail national, in effect, to ensure that everyone in America would get a ballot in the mail. I mean, in other words, the Constitution makes it clear that elections are essentially governed by local rules, but we could have the federal government give all Americans the opportunity to get a ballot in the mail. I think that this debate may change a little bit because as a result of the hacking and everything that was discussed over the last few months, the fact that our vote by mail system ensures that there's a paper trail probably helps us advance that cause. So I'm going to push that very hard, and I keep making the point, we've got 20 years of history now, and we've got a lot higher turnout. It's cheaper. We've not seen the fraud that the critics said was going to take place. So I'm very much committed to this, and we're having some conversations with some conservatives in the Congress, and I hope we'll be able to bring some of them aboard.
You had spoken about personal ways to help with environmentalism. My question to you is where you're prioritizing global climate change in this kind of transition where a lot of people are worrying about what is going to happen with that in the coming years.
I think it's extraordinarily important, and my wife and I are older parents. We have twins that are 9 and a baby who's 4. And they were at the swearing in, and you might have seen the picture because William Peter Wyden, when I was asked to raise my right hand, he raised his right hand as well. And Joe Biden looked over at him, then looked at me and congratulated him and said, "William, welcome to the United States Senate. You'll do a fine job." So when you have 3 small children, and particularly older parents like my wife and I, you think a lot about this. And to me, there are kind of 2 parts to the equation. One, do you think there is a problem? And we can have that debate. I happen to think that we do. And you look at the numbers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, and it's pretty clear that we have a problem when I look at the science. Then the question is, what can you do about it that is practical and smart? And for example, we just got the largest research grant on something I'm very proud of for tidal and wave energy, which I think is very, very promising. So I think there are a lot of ways in which Oregon can step up and show that if you think there's a problem, there are a variety of ways that could get support across the political spectrum and would really put points on the board in the fight against climate change. So I think it's very important. At one time I was chairman of the Energy Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and I'm staying on that committee. So I think it's serious business.
What will you do to actively protect American values the Constitution, and the majority of Americans who not only didn't vote for Mr. Trump, but voted for his opponent?
First of all, I wrote a long essay for the New York Times yesterday that's online, so if you're having trouble sleeping tonight, you can read that and get a sense of it. Look, Donald Trump won the election, okay? And I have enormous respect for the institutions of the United States. Now, I obviously have profound disagreements with the president-elect on a whole host of issues. And we've already heard several of them expressed here in the last 10 minutes. I think the first challenge, which is what I talked about in this essay, is understanding what are sort of baseline requirements and protections that we have always insisted on. For example, after 40 years with anybody who is running for president, a Democrat or a Republican, a conservative or liberal, making their tax returns available, that tradition was essentially thrown in the trash can. So I wish you didn't need a piece of legislation, but I think you do now, so I've introduced a bill. There's dozens of sponsors in the Congress saying that you would have to make your taxes available. If you didn't, the Treasury Department would, in effect, set about to putting those online. And people ask me about this, and I have said, this is sort of a baseline of transparency and accountability that is really a touchstone for everything else. And in this essay, I basically argued, now every single time there is an allegation or a rumor or something that's unsubstantiated, it takes on a whole aura of conflict and debate, and it's almost like you cut our government down, with each additional question that raises doubt about the credibility of the government. And so I feel very strongly that we need that bill. I feel very strongly that the president-elect should do what has been done traditionally in these situations, which is put his assets in a blind trust. I feel strongly about protection through what's called the emolument clause, which means that you cannot use your office to advance your personal interests. And to me, these are just sort of the basic requirements we've come to expect as citizens in terms of transparency and accountability. I mean, you're going to walk out of here and you're going to agree with me about this or you're going to agree with me about that. But what I hope you'll say is Ron made a pledge when he was first elected to do something, which was to show up in every county, and for 90 minutes, we could ask whatever we wanted and he could be held accountable. So I think that's really the coin of good government. And my hope is that after Friday, the president-elect will set aside some of the practices that I've just mentioned. I hope that he will have daily intelligence briefings. Lord knows I've disagreed with the intelligence community on a lot of things. But he basically, a couple of days ago, said that they were Nazis. His words, not mine. So I hope that after Friday that we will see some of the practices over the last few weeks and through the campaign set aside, and core principles that relate to transparency and accountability get set in place.
Thank you very much. Mine is not a question, but it's a way to show my appreciation to Senator Ron Wyden, who helped me in my acquisition of my U.S. visa to come to Western Oregon University. I thank you so much. I have a parcel for you, a gift. to show my appreciation. This is from Ghana. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Well, I know that your friends and neighbors and classmates are very proud of you, and it's so good of you to come, and I look forward to enjoying the gift. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank you for your good work in Congress, and good luck in the next 4 years, and don't back off.
Well, thank you. You know, the real question always comes back to, if you want to get the important stuff done, you've got to find a way to bring people together. And that's what I've always put my focus on. I had a bipartisan health reform bill. We had 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans on it. First time, a bipartisan universal, coverage bill. So what I've tried to make the point is, on the Affordable Care Act, which we're talking about, now, if people want to set aside this kind of partisan approach where we're just going to repeal it and then maybe someday we'll do something else, I'm very open to working with Democrats and Republicans in order to strengthen the Affordable Care Act. I think there are a variety of practical ideas we could take. I have some ideas, for example, on getting younger and healthier people in the system, which is especially important. In the Affordable Care Act, I was able to get a provision that gives states a lot of flexibility in terms of what they're doing. So Oregon could, for example, set up a public option. We could make the decision in our state, without passing any new laws, we could make the decision to set up a public option, which could help hold down the cost of medicine and the cost of insurance. So your point about, what's ahead, I'm going to do everything to find common ground. I think we can on some issues like roads and bridges. We're not going to find common ground on setting up religious registries, I'll tell you that. I think it's just unconstitutional. I really do. It's contrary to everything that Oregon's always been about. We've always been about, we had Republican governors, we had Democratic governors, we had Republican legislators, we had state legislators. We were always about trying to show that we had good ideas and we were innovative and we were going to lead the country. And we'd take them from anybody, but they weren't divisive. They were ideas that brought people together. So I hope that, and this is apropos of the question the gentleman asked about the president-elect, is I hope once we get by Friday, we start a different approach.
Our cities in Polk County often talk about having water supplies good for the next 20 to 30 years. What do you see the federal government's role in maintaining water quantity and water quality?
It's very appropriate that you bring this up, because there's no question that water is going to be one of the paramount challenges of our time. And right even before I left Washington, D.C., in some discussions about infrastructure, I and others were making the point that in addition to roads and bridges, we needed to consider as a basic part of infrastructure things like sewer and water systems and the like, because you clearly cannot have big league economic growth and big league quality of life with all these outdated kind of systems. And in 2009, I was able to get some very small sums of money for some rural Oregon communities to deal with their water systems, and it has really paid off. So I think you're on to something, and when you hear legislators talk about infrastructure, roads and bridges and transportation systems, I think the operative question is, will you include in that water and sewer, which has too often in the past not been included? A couple things. One, I haven't gotten a chance to see it, but apparently the person that the president-elect has named to head the VA is getting pretty good marks. I'm going to need to have a chance to sit down with him and visit. But in both cases, they're really budget issues, and they're issues that relate to your priorities. If somebody asks me about the priorities for our country, and particularly our national security priorities, reservists have got to be right at the top of the list, because like in our state, we've got reserve folks who've done 2, 3, 4 tours of duty. Paul Evans, of course, knows much more about these issues than practically anybody. So in both of these areas, I'm very much committed to using the budget process to be supportive of the reservists and the services that you're mentioning.
My question, do you agree with Congressman John Lewis' statement just recently that Donald Trump is not a legitimate president? And if so, why would you say why, or why do you not agree with that?
I just saw a little clip on it as I saw, and I didn't get to take it in the context. So let me kind of sort of pass on exactly what John Lewis said. What I can tell you is John Lewis is one of the public figures I respect most in America. I've worked with him often over the years. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Tax Writing Committee. He is on the counterpart committee, the House Ways and Means Committee. This is an enormously influential, thoughtful, and decent man. So I haven't had a chance yet to dissect, what was said. I've told you, I believe Donald Trump won the election. Now, clearly, there are a whole host of issues. When someone asked about the question of the investigation, I strongly support that. That's why I was the one who asked the questions of Mr. Comey on Tuesday with respect to whether he was following up on these public, press reports of involvement with the Russians in the election. And part of this is also about your view with respect to American institutions. I was asked yesterday at the community meeting, was I going to go to the inauguration? I will attend the inauguration because the inauguration is about an American institution. It is about the institution of the presidency. Now, I can tell you that my wife and I won't be dressed up in any tuxedos that night, going off at balls, and I heard there was a Blazer game, so if I can get my NBA package, cranked up, we'll watch that. We are going to march the next day in the protest against the president-elect's views. Against the president-elect's views on women's health care. And the Finance Committee is really the pay-for committee in American healthcare, so I see what the consequences are of walking back those kinds of healthcare services for vulnerable, women. And I saw an ad somewhere. It said, what did it say? It said, nobody is going to get hurt by repealing the Affordable Care Act. And I said, boy, tell that to thousands of Oregon women and many in rural areas who use Planned Parenthood for services like cancer screenings. Cancer screenings, there's nothing abortion, it's cancer screenings. So I hope that responds to your question, but that's kind of what I'm doing with respect to the inauguration.
As the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, you have had a pivotal role in regards to trade policy, including the TPA, TPP, and TTIP. These trade issues brought together in staunch and vocal opposition many conservative and liberal groups. It's a bipartisan issue. And it helped push the president-elect over the top. How will you oppose unfavorable trade policy introduced from the Trade Preferences Extension Act of 2015, vehicle you helped to drive through Congress, and now the Republicans have the keys?
Very important question. And let me take a couple minutes to unpack the whole kind of trade issue in terms of what it means for Oregon, and then I'll walk through some of these agreements and the things you mentioned. 1 out of 5 jobs in Oregon revolves around international trade. And the trade jobs often pay better than do the non-trade jobs. And that's because they reflect a higher level of productivity and value added. So if somebody comes up to me and asks me my economic philosophy at Fred Meyer, for example, and one of my claims to fame is I believe I've had a barbecue chicken at every Fred Meyer in Oregon. So a lot of business gets done, about government. I will tell people, you want my economic philosophy? What we ought to do in Oregon is grow it here, build it here, add value to it here, and then ship it somewhere. That's my philosophy in a sentence. And I think it's particularly relevant because there are going to be 1 billion middle-class consumers in the developing world in a few years, and they love buying Oregon stuff. They just love buying the kind of stuff we make. So I think this is really right at the heart of what we need to do to get more high-skill, high-wage jobs. Now, it is very clear, I mean, we've already withdrawn from what's called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific, partnership, so that's not going to happen. And I think you were asking about the European agreement. I don't think Mr. Trump, President-elect, is going to go ahead with that. So I guess the question then becomes, so what are you going to be for now, Ron? I mean, what are you going to do? As you said, I'm the senior guy on the committee with jurisdiction over trade. And if you're a glutton for punishment, I wrote a long speech really for our business summit with respect to outlining trade from here. And if I were going to sum it up, is I want a trade policy now as we look to, in effect, reevaluate everything in the trade arena. Is I want a policy that is tough, and I want a policy that is smart. Now, on the tough side, one of the good things that happened last year is the Congress passed and President Obama signed what was called the enforcement package, the customs and enforcement package, which included a number of my bills, including the one I wrote after we ran a sting operation, set up a phony website to catch people trying to get around the dumping laws and the countervailing duty laws and the like. So I would think the president-elect would be very interested and supportive of that. That's tough. It's about enforcing the law. It's not about chasing new bills or TPPs or agreements or anything like that. It's about enforcing the laws on the books. Now, in addition to the tough part, I want us to be smart. And let me give you an example. Did a lot of you follow earlier in the year the situation with Apple, where the government wanted to get access to the Apple phone and it was going to be broken into, and in effect, the president-elect said that he wanted to weaken strong encryption, which is what you use to protect your data. I am very, very much opposed to that. I think it's a mistake from a security standpoint, because strong encryption is one of the things that allows you to protect yourself with your smartphone. I think it is a mistake from a liberty standpoint, because it means that bad guys are going to be able to get access, to your conversations. And I think it is stupid from an economic standpoint, because if we do what it looks like the president-elect wants to do, which is to require companies to build back doors into their products to defeat strong encryption, what's going to happen is our companies will have more problems competing with people overseas. So I'm going into this when people ask me the very good question you're asking about, what's going to happen now, is I'm going to be working for a trade policy that is tough and a policy that is smart, and I hope that we can convince the president-elect's team to be supportive of that. Can I respond to your question?
My question is, have you been following NuScale Technologies out of Corvallis? And if so, what are you doing to support them?
We have been very supportive of them, and it really was a priority of mine when I was chairman of the Energy Committee. I think that NuScale is talking about sort of a new vision of nuclear. It's going to be smaller and more mobile reactors. I mean, I think that a big part of what NuScale is doing, and we live right off Cesar Chavez in Glenwood. So if you were really strong, you could practically throw a baseball from our backyard into the Reed the yard going into the Reed College. Reed's got a reactor. I mean, hardly anybody knows that. And as far as I can tell, the students practically pet their nuclear reactors sometimes when they're on their way to lunch. So there are a lot of approaches that I think represent a very different generation of technology and applicability as it relates to the nuclear space. So I've been very supportive of NuScale and have tried to use my position on the Energy Committee to make sure that they would continue to have expanded opportunities. I think this is very promising for Oregon.
What, if anything, can be done to change the Electoral College to more accurately reflect voters today? The fact that votes in one state count more than votes in other states, rackles me to my bones.
Well, there's a lot to be rackled about. And obviously, we're going to think through now a whole host of issues relating, to campaigns. For example, if you asked me what my single biggest priority would be, it would be overturning Citizens United, the Supreme Court case, which basically has ensured that a rich guy's checkbook is no different than a poor person's soapbox, which I think is just a preposterous kind of theory. I'm for getting rid of superdelegates in the campaign. I was a superdelegate, and I said, boy, I don't think people think I'm so super, and nobody's delegated anything to me, so let's get rid of that. And that doesn't seem to me to be a very democratic process. And I'm open to looking at a variety of changes with respect to the Electoral College. I mean, originally it was set up so that places like Oregon and Idaho would have a voice and a vote, and you wouldn't just have the presidential candidates showing up in the places where the people were. So they could just go to California and Texas and Florida and maybe a couple other places and call it a day. So I'm thinking it through, and it may well be that given the trend towards nationalizing with today's communications and transportation, we ought to just do this as a popular vote. I'm just concerned, and I spend a big chunk of my day trying to make sure that people back there don't forget about us, because we're 3,000 miles away from DC and New York and all the power and all that. So I'm thinking it through, but I'm open to making that change. You for getting rid of the Electoral College and just kind of having popular vote? Well, there's no question about that, and that's why if you ask me for my first choice, it's overturning Citizens United, number one, and getting elections to the point where instead of having a campaign that starts, we have an election the first Tuesday in November, people sleep in on Wednesday, and the fundraising starts all over again on Thursday. My first choice would be get rid of Citizens United and shorten the period where you could do all the campaign fundraising. Those would be my first two choices, because I look at a lot of people in Congress, they don't do town hall meetings. What they do is they use their free time basically running around the golf courses and all kinds of things, because that's what the system puts premiums on, which is just going out and raising money. I've had people say, I hear you do all these town hall meetings and you go to little places. I bet there are a lot of people in those little places that don't vote for you. And I said, that's not exactly the point. You get an election certificate to represent everybody. And everybody knows my hometown is Portland at this point. I wish I could have played in the NBA. I went to school on a basketball scholarship. It was delusional that I was going to play in the NBA because I was too small, and I made up for it by being really slow. So I wasn't going to do that. I love Portland. Love it. But I don't represent the state of Portland. I represent every nook and cranny. And so we're going to be going to Wagon Tire and all kinds of, really tiny places, because they count too. And so that's what we ought to be doing, is looking for ways in which more people can be heard in a more accessible way.
What is a way on a more immediate basis that we can make our voices heard? Organized call systems or something, but I come from a state where I don't want to call my congressman. I want to be calling congresspeople from other parts, or senators from other parts of the country. Are all calls equal, or do they ask for your zip code, or how can we make our voices heard on a more immediate basis?
We'll be able to tell you more as we get beyond Friday and we actually start to see what a new administration chooses to do, because clearly we're moving out of the campaign and into the kind of governing period. For example, the president-elect in the campaign said he was for waterboarding, he was for torture, and he wanted to go beyond that. And then apparently he talked to his defense person, General Mathis. General Mathis said, no, that doesn't work. I get more done with a six-pack and a couple packs of cigarettes. And President-elect said, okay. So what we're going to have to see is exactly what the policies are. I personally think there are a few things that are sort of naturals. If we get a budget, for example, that substantially cuts the funds for low-income hunger programs, number one, I'll use my seat on the Budget Committee to oppose that. But number two, we're going to need a lot of people pitching in at the pantries and the shelters, and this is an area with a lot of agriculture, and so people are going to be able to get involved that way. And I think probably the best thing you can do is find one more person to join you in this effort of speaking out with elected officials, participating in local programs. I spend a lot of time with what are called whistleblowers, people who work in the various agencies and can tell us what's actually going on. But if there's one thing you can do, it's find one more person to join you and pitch in. How's that young man doing? Did you come voluntarily or Cool. Is there anything you would like to talk about?
I wanted to know if any children can make a difference.
Can children make a difference? They really can make a difference because what a great question to see. Everybody here really likes it because a lot of us understand that a big part of our job is to make sure that what we're doing is going to work for kids. And let me guess your age. Are you like 9 or 10? You're 11. Okay, so my twins are 9, and the baby is 4. And my wife and I were married at the Oregon coast. I bet you've been to Haystack Rock? Okay. So anytime my little girl, who's only 4, sees it, she goes, Mommy, Daddy, Haystack Rock. And she's made it really clear to us that even though she's 4 years old and is just a kid, she wants to make sure, and she doesn't really know what I do. She goes, Daddy, Senate, suits. And she thinks that we go off to the Senate and we wear suits and we talk a lot. But I've told her that a big part of what I want to do in our state is to make sure that there are policies so that all the kids are going to be able to enjoy the Oregon coast in years to come. And we've got some big things to do. You've been hearing about tsunamis and earthquakes and stuff like that. So I really appreciate what you said, and I think one of the most important things I can do is listen to kids. So I am really glad you came. Thank you.
Are you aware of the thousands of college professors who are now in prison in Turkey, the thousands of journalists, the thousands of political dissidents, and the extreme, fascist nature of, frankly, it is a fascist government now in Turkey. Are you prepared to advocate, or are you prepared to go along with a stronger approach to Turkey, up to and possibly including an expulsion from NATO, if that is possible?
Well, as you know, Erdogan and the repressive practices that you're talking about are very real. And yes, we are going to have to up the ante in terms of putting pressure on the government with respect to the kind of repressive practices you're talking about. I sit on the Intelligence Committee, the two national security committees, the Intelligence Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So obviously I can't talk about anything classified, and I think you want to tailor the remedy to something that really makes sense. As you know, this is a hugely important part of the world. The Turks have taken steps in the past to be constructive. The developments that you're talking about that are particularly recent are very, very ominous. So let's just say I feel what they're doing now with respect to the human rights violations must not stand, A. And B, I'm thinking through what the remedy is because you want to make sure you got a remedy that didn't worsen the problem.